I did not think about ending the podcast until I recorded the 150th voice. And as I typed 150, the number looked nice and well-rounded. I thought, wouldn't it be nice to stop here? Got a huge smile on my face. First, it's like a celebration of the 150 episodes, but it also does feel like a few doors opening to new opportunities. But to be able to just formally say goodbye to the listeners also feels really, really good. Welcome to your favorite podcast, 1000 African Voices, broadcasting from an African perspective. 1000 African Voices is a program aimed at breaking down the boundaries that divide us as a continent, the boundaries that divide our beautiful people. You can also find the show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast by searching for 1000 African Voices. Our website address is 1000africanvoices.com. We are calling this series Africa's Future Reimagined. Your host is Avhurengwi. Welcome.
1000 African Voices.
Welcome everyone to 1000 African Voices. It's not your usual host who's hosting this podcast today. My name is Lazola Bele. I was actually the 41st voice featured in the series. And today we thought, let's mix up the podcast. And I bring you a very special guest. I will allow him an opportunity to just introduce himself, and then we can get this conversation going. So my esteemed guest, can you tell our audience who you are?
Oh, lovely. No, thanks, Lazo. I've actually always wanted to be esteemed, so it actually feels really good to be on this side of the conversation. So I'm Avhurengwi, the host of 1000 African Voices, and I've hosted 150 episodes over a 3-year period. This will be the last time that I am either hosting or being interviewed, so I couldn't have asked for a better person to do this with than the 41st guest himself, Mr. Lazola Bele. So yeah, thanks Lazola for agreeing to do this. I cannot wait. Got a huge smile on my face. First, it's like a celebration of the 150 episodes, but it also does feel like a few doors opening to new opportunities. But to be able to just formally say goodbye to the listeners also feels really, really good. So yeah, thank you. I will play this role and hopefully I will be a good guest. So yeah, over to you.
Okay. Yeah, it is a bit nerve-wracking to sit on your shoes after observing you do such a wonderful job for so many episodes. And I've been cracking my skull to say how do I make it interesting? What questions do I ask? Thinking about my experience when you were interviewing me. But I think, what brings about this conversation is really, the conclusion of a very important, shall I say, series to the African child and an important production, really. So I want to start the conversation at that point. It's 150 episode in. I imagine there was a lot of work that went into that. What brought about this idea of this podcast to begin with? I can imagine coordinating all these people, reaching out, recording, editing. Take us to the beginning. You were sleeping, you woke up, and then bam, or how did it germinate in your head?
I remember I was listening to a podcast, the Tim Ferriss show, It's one of the more popular business podcasts. And as I was listening to Tim, I feel like we're on a first name basis because I've listened to at least 200 of his episodes.
Yeah.
But I was listening to that. I remember I was on a jog, sort of doing my morning run. And I remember thinking, yes, I'm absorbing so much of this American content. I really wish there were more African products or African podcasts that I could listen to. But I've always wanted to know more about our own continent. So I am a South African, and after 150 episodes, I've actually never said out loud on the show that I am South African. I was always conscious of that. I wanted to think of myself more as an African. So I thought there will be a few podcasts, or at least there should be. So I started looking, and I remember I found the African Tech Roundup by my good friend, I'll get the name now, but I found the African Tech Roundup. Then after that, I really couldn't find anything else. And I thought to myself, what if I was the person that I am waiting for? The old adage that sometimes you are the person that you've been waiting for all along. But I didn't really have confidence first in my technical ability to put together a podcast. Secondly, can I really be a good host? But ultimately, I thought, you don't really need to be a good host. If you have the passion, and I had lots of that, I really wanted to cover Africa. So I thought, let's try 1 or 2 episodes. Let's see how it goes. And 3 years later, we've spoken to quite a lot of people. And over time, obviously, you grow into the role, you develop a lot of confidence, and you kind of refine your skills. So to answer your question, it was really more a desire to create an African podcast. And I think we've done that really in the last 3 years. And I'm happy that there have been a lot more podcasts that have come up since then.
Yeah. I mean, I think before the end of the show, please give us a whole list of those podcasts. I am also quite an avid podcast consumer, and I will agree with you. There's so much American content, very good content, but you start to miss, the African flavor. And I think it's time we look at that aspect of things. I'm actually looking at it. I'm like, 40 months later, that's it's almost humble when you put it a month, because it doesn't seem that long. I mean, 3.25 years is quite a long time, doing the series. And I think from my perspective personally, having followed the podcast, perhaps more specifically after I was featured at 41, I've got to really meet interesting individuals on the podcast. And so I almost got the sense that now, I want more. There's many different parts of Africa that are very difficult to access. And maybe this is a channel for us to really get perspective from those parts of the continent. And so my question is, why now? Why bring the series to the end now? Is there a particular reason about the timing, or is it just, a feeling where it's done its course, it's created or cemented the idea that we can podcast, and then perhaps it's time to create space? What was your thinking at ending the series at this point?
Yeah, the funny thing is, I did not think about ending the podcast until I recorded the 150th voice. And as I typed 150, the number looked nice and well-rounded. I thought, wouldn't it be nice to stop here? But it's a thought or an idea that had been sort of brewing, but I didn't think it will end at 150. I always thought I'll take it to 200. But I could feel that my energy level was no longer where it needed to be. And for me, I think I have a responsibility as a host to bring my full self to every conversation. I mean, if I think of some of the best episodes that we had, I kind of remember the level of energy that I had. But coming to 150, I started to struggle with my energy level. Some of the work that I do outside the podcast kind of overtook the podcast. So I found myself struggling to make time. But I sort of noticed a decline in the quality of the output that we were putting out there. And I felt that I respect the 1,000 African Voices so much that if I am not bringing 100% to the show, then the fair thing to do is to step aside and maybe create space for someone else who may step into that space. And yes, it may not be the same podcast, but it may be the same idea of connecting Africans. So yeah, after 3 years, I felt first, it's a long enough time to engage in really anything and do a good job of it. But primarily, it came down to me no longer having the same level of energy that I need to do a good job. So that intensity dropped. Even if it's a 5% drop for me, it's enough. So I just felt it was time, and 150 felt like a really good time. We did not cover all the states, but we covered most of them. And I think we really got to the core of the African story that we wanted to package and present to our listeners.
I'm quite moved by the fact that you wanted to quit while you are ahead, but also the mention that you respect the platform and you wanted to make sure that it does not lose quality. So I can respect that. I can respect that. I did listen to the last episode that you posted, the 150 with Tsitsi Mutendi from Zimbabwe, and what a way to really close. I mean, I found her to be such an interesting individual and just so full of life and hope. And with COVID happening, with the challenges of Zimbabwe or many African countries, it really sort of ignited in me to say, all right, the platform might still be relevant. You might not be the host. Have you entertained the idea that perhaps story is still out there and we could proceed with the series, and then you give a different host a chance, and perhaps you get involved as more of an executive producer, or as where your direct involvement is less required. Any plans around that, or you sort of want to give it a chance and see how you feel after having raised this baby for so long?
I've got a huge smile now. So as you were asking, have I considered? I thought, and I'll maybe give our listeners a bit of a background. So about, I think in 2013, so 8 years, give or take, I decided to improve how I speak by enrolling in a program called the Toastmasters. And hopefully some of our listeners will be familiar with that. And through Toastmasters... Well, I am. Yes, and so I'm bringing it up. So through Toastmasters, you learn a lot about how to speak, how to deliver a speech, how to read a room, how to maybe minimize some of the ums and ahs. And I learned quite a lot. But the biggest thing I got from the program was meeting great minds. I met lots and lots of great people. And one of the persons that I met, and we've had a relationship now for about 8 years, was yourself, Lazola. I sort of followed your path. I followed the work that you did with, and you're still doing that DT, Africa. And it's only in this very instance that you're asking the question, I'm thinking, hey, this might actually be like a passing of the baton type moment. I know you're very passionate about the continent, so perhaps this may actually be an introduction of our new host to the listeners. We can talk about that after, but I think it may be a natural transition to someone who's arguably even more passionate about the continent than I am.
Well, I mean, you certainly are dangling a carrot there. I mean, I will admit I love the topic of Africa and any opportunity to meet as many Africans as I can, it would be worthwhile. But let's not finish that conversation here. I think, there's a lot of thinking and commitment that goes into that. I'm curious, though. I'm curious just to move the conversation along. How many people have you interviewed in total? Do you know? I know you've done 150 episodes, but if I remember correctly, there were episodes where you would have engaged multiple people. And I know this is almost like saying pick your favorite child out of your entire children. But I'll put it out there to say, what has been your most interesting story or interview, or it's not necessarily about the person, not necessarily about, it's just the one story that kind of like stands out, and you always sort of think back to it and say, oh my goodness, what a conversation.
It's an excellent question. And it's a question that I must admit, I thought about it all week, because it's an unavoidable question to say, okay, you've spoken to, and I actually don't know how many guests we've had. I know we've done 150 episodes. If I were to guess, I'd then say anything between 170 and 80. I have not counted. And from all the guests, do I have a favorite? I actually do. And I won't shy away from the question, because I think the politically right thing to say is they're all unique, But the one that I've thought about the most is episode 4. And I know the episode number because we featured Robert Katende from Uganda.
Yes.
Yeah, we were quite new at the time. The confidence wasn't really there. I remember on a Sunday, I was watching a movie called The Queen of Katwe. It's a movie about a young girl, chess protege, but the man behind the lady or the girl is the teacher, Robert Katende. So it's a movie based on the life of Robert Katende. I sent him an email. He agreed to come on the show. And I remember exactly where I was sitting. And that was the only time I shed a tear on the show, was when I was interviewing Robert Katende. As I'm talking now, in my head, I have his voice saying, my name is Robert Katende. He's from Kampala, Uganda, humble man who's chosen to dedicate his life to improving the lives of young people from the slums of Kampala. So that in terms of impact, really hit me hard to say, here's someone, a trained engineer who could have chosen any career, but he chose to better the lives of young people in Kampala. So in terms of impact, that's definitely the top one for me. Just in terms of the quality of conversation, and the one that I have personally replayed the most, it was an episode we did with the South African global speaker, Vusi Thembekwayo. That was, can't remember the number, but Vusi Thembekwayo was, first, is someone that I grew up idolizing as a speaker. But what I like about Vusi is he's younger than me. He's 4 or 5 years younger than me. And when I watch him or listen to him, I do not have the excuse of age. Sometimes you look at someone and think, he's doing better, he's greater, he's more inspirational because he's had more life experience. Vusi is much younger. But the quality of the content, the quality of his speech, the man has really thought about big life topics. So I really, really enjoyed that. So those would be the two that stand out. The third one would be episode 66. We had Boni Mbuli, a South African actress. And I remember as a young person watching Boni Mbuli, and I remember not liking the characters that she portrayed. But after the interview, I remember thinking, my goodness, am I glad to have the privilege to talk to people like Bonnie Mbuli, inspirational, well-spoken, and she really does represent this quintessential African that we all are always hoping to find. So though those three will be, if I were to list, will be in my top three for different reasons.
Powerful reasoning around choosing those particular stories. I must say, it's encouraging to hear how much they've impacted you, and we hope they've impacted the listeners just as much. I want to take you to another question where I've looked at the spread of people that you were able to interview over this period. This including politicians, this including CEOs, musicians, actresses, influencers, and certainly in countries that are not very easy to access as well. I mean, I just forgot the gentleman's name, but I was listening to an interview you did with a guy from Somalia. And now when one listens to an interview on the podcast, it's an interview, it's a sharing of perspectives and ideas. But when I actually visited Somalia, I think it's almost 2 years now, and I got a sense of what Somalia is and some of the tension that's there, that interview became important, that you were able to gain access to someone from that part of the world and share insight to them. South Sudan also comes to mind. You've engaged people from there. So take us through your process. Firstly, how big is your team? Or how big was your team over these years? And how do you find, the important voices in the continent? I mean, you did mention that you emailed Joseph from Uganda. But I mean, I imagine it's not always that easy, where you just send an email and you get a response and someone says yes. Sometimes you might have to do a little bit of work. So what's your process in identifying, engaging, and then, of course, getting to a point where I agree with the interviewer to come and feature on your podcast?
That's such an excellent question, because I think it allows us to touch on many different things. First, what it takes to put together a podcast. In the 3 years, I have seen people trying to do a podcast. So someone will come on 1000 African Voices. I imagine they will then think, oh, I can do that. And yes, every person can do it. But to continue to run and produce an episode every week for 3 years, it's really, really difficult. The stamina, you need a team, and I'll answer your question regarding the size of the team. You need the drive, the reach, etc. So in terms of the size of the team, fundamentally, there are 3 people in my experience that you need. So one is the host. So I'm the host and executive producer. I provide direction to the team in terms of how we select our guests. There are different resources that we use. One of the guests that we've had is Prince Akbar from Ghana. He runs Avhurengwi Media, and every year they'll publish the top 100 most influential young Africans. And that's such a great resource to have an organization that is dedicated to generating that list. So we use that as a resource. We also use magazines such as Forbes. So I'll go and look at, Forbes, who are they talking to? Who are, say, maybe the top 30 under 30 on the continent, and we try and reach out to those. Then you look at Time Magazine. They do this top 100 most influential Africans on an annual basis. So that's also a good resource. But the 3 team members that you need, or at least that we had, it's myself as the host and executive producer. Then you need a researcher and a scheduler. So it's 2 roles. So that's the person who will reach out to the potential guests, either via email or sliding into someone's DM, connecting on Instagram, YouTube, whatever platform there may be. That is by far the most difficult part of the job. Of the, say, 20 inquiries that you send, you're lucky if you get 2. So you can imagine 18 rejections all the time is exhausting. So that's the second resource, researcher and scheduler. And the person also, in our case, helped with reporting because we needed to report to the SABC. The third person is a sound engineer. I had to learn sound engineering. Sorry, I'll offend the sound engineers. I had to learn how to produce an episode. But after, I think, about 25 episodes, I stopped and we looked for a professional. We found a guy from Bosnia, Sam Ganic, and he produced at least 100 episodes. So you get a guest, you do you record, you send the file to the engineer, and 4 or 5 days later, you get the file back. Obviously, you sort of comment on what can be refined. So you can do it alone, but it's quite demanding. In our case, we had 3. For some successful, very successful podcasts, that number can go up to 30. But then you're talking about a different level. We managed with the 3.
That makes good sense. It sort of paints the picture, quite beautifully. As I'm listening to you sort of list the 3 roles, and as much as you had a managed team in terms of size, I can't get away from the question of financial resourcing such a project. I'm also taken to some of the work we do with Hadithia Africa, running the storytelling contest, the African storytelling contest. In theory, it does not really sound demanding. It does not really sound financially demanding, with the prevalence of social media and those kind of things. But you do need to fund it to a degree. So I want to get your sense in terms of, how your relationship with SABC was, and whether was there any funding that you needed to be able to consistently produce this episode. And I just want the listeners to get an appreciation, because most of the time we do things for the love. And as much as we do things for the love and there's an appreciation, we forget that love is not expressed free in the real scheme of things. So what has been your experience in terms of that? And of course, you can touch on the relationship you had with the SABC.
Man, the questions you're asking are, to be honest, I was hoping for this depth of questioning so that those who may want to pursue podcasting or digital content production will have a good idea. Without the support from the South African Broadcasting Corporation, I would have had to play the role of host, executive producer, researcher, and sound engineer. That is a lot to do, and one can question the sustainability thereof. I just worked it out now as you were asking. We have spent, in the 3 years, just to produce all the episodes, it worked out to $20,000. It may not sound like much, but having to pay that from your pocket is quite taxing. So for every episode, we needed to pay the sound engineer and pay the scheduler. I was obviously not really getting paid, but in total, we're looking at $20,000 for the 150 episodes. Without that support, I don't think that we could have gone past the first 50 episodes. As mentioned, I did the first 25 on my own. Then I could tell that I was really getting fatigued. So I don't think we would have made it to 150. So you are right that you do need funding to be able to express yourself and get your messaging out there. So yeah, getting funding is really, really critical. And I'm happy that there are now podcasts that seem to have a different business model where they're able to generate their own funding from the number of listeners they have or their Patreon accounts. Most of them have moved to the YouTube platform, which is great because then they can self-fund. For us, though, we relied 100% on the funding from the South African Broadcasting Corporation.
Right. I mean, I think it makes for a good story, to actually hear that, because then it's an important work that you were doing. It's an important work that the SABC also got involved in terms of really pushing the African story. And in the world we are in, digital content transcends boundaries. And so really this kind of content is going to be so important, and it's going to matter so much for generations to come. Let's go a bit personal into the person who you are. I know you've been doing broadcasting, but I have on good authority that your background is not in broadcasting. And so maybe just take us through, what your other career is. And I mention that because I think I want to encourage listeners, and especially young listeners, to understand that what you might have studied as a professional career does not mean it does not define you. You can do that well, but if you have other interests, you are allowed to pursue them, no matter how far away they are from what you otherwise would have been seen from a professional point of view. So share with us, what outside of broadcasting this podcast, what keeps your day occupied?
Yeah, thanks, Blazol. We're really nailing the questions. It's I think our aforementioned point really bears reference in terms of the right person to carry on the mission of 1,000 African voices.
There.
So I'll maybe touch on what I do during the day, which leads to why at times I'd feel fatigued. So I'm in the mining sector. I work for a listed company doing business in coal mining. So we mine coal used by electricity generation stations, and some of it goes to the international market. My role is sort of focusing on mines that used to produce coal, and over time they've had to close. So my role is really to manage those operations so that we're sort of dealing with the sustainability elements of a closed mine. But in terms of what I studied about 16, 17 years ago now, I enrolled for a geology degree for 4 years. Then I pursued a master's degree in the same field immediately after that. Then later on, I went on to do another master's degree in mining engineering, so more or less in the same field. And I really do like the work that we do because it gives us an opportunity to, when you're managing mines that are closed, there are usually communities around those mines. So the conversation around environmental stewardship and the sustainability of the communities in those mines does become an important conversation to have. I then last year decided to enroll for a postgraduate diploma in digital business. And I think part of it has to do with the podcast. I started really wanting to go deeper into not only producing digital content, but having an academic understanding of first how to produce digital content, but more importantly, understanding the foundation technology on which this digital content lives. So I completed that last year, and that it has really helped me to understand the fourth industrial revolution a bit more, a topic that I'm really passionate about. And within the podcast, for about 30 episodes, we did try and explore that. So I studied geology. I work in the mining sector in the South African coal mining space. And I continue to do that. And it's something that I really, really enjoy because we get to make a positive impact every day that we go to work. But again, I must say, without that funding my lifestyle, it would have been difficult, I think, to launch and sustain 1,000 African Voices. So maybe that's another topic of discussion, to say you may have this job that you have to do, but if your passion lies elsewhere, how do you fund that passion, and how do you continue to cultivate it so that, yes, you do what you need to do from a career perspective, but you are able to fuel the passion that you have. And my passion has always been the African narrative, and to be able to positively contribute to shaping that.
I think with that, you're speaking to the converted. I think what I normally tell young people is to say, there are things you are good at and the things you are passionate about. Understand that sometimes the things you're passionate about are not going to pay you, but they feed your soul. And the things you're good at might not feed your soul, but they pay for your passion. And so we need to be able to balance that. And certainly I get exactly where you're coming from, because a lot of the consulting work that I've done over the years really have been instrumental in funding my passion for the continent and my travels for the continent. Which brings me to actually my second last question I've got for you, which is, you've spoken to all these Africans, you've spent copious amount of time researching them. I don't know how traveled you are in the continent, but certainly from the countries that you've never been to, which country really generated an interest in you, obviously through whoever you've interviewed and you wish to visit within the continent?
So I'll give you two answers. The first is a country I visited after speaking to a guest. And after speaking to Landry, I think Landry was in our top 10, if I remember, the fifth voice, Landry Maigane, who is in Rwanda, but he's lived in the DR Congo and Mali. But he spoke a lot about Rwanda. And I had always had this interest in Rwanda. But after that episode, I really went deep into understanding what makes Rwanda tick. So after a few months, I planned a trip and ended up in Kigali. And it ended up being sort of one of the best trips I've ever had in terms of getting my eyes opened a bit more to understand that there are actually countries in Africa that are ahead of the curve in terms of development, and Rwanda is one of those.
Okay.
Then,
right.
In terms of a country that I think we've probably spoken to 8 to 10 guests from Ghana. So I've not been to Ghana, but after speaking to Ghanaians, first, I've always known that first their politics or their political framework is quite stable, so it allows the country to continue to develop and prosper. But we've always known that collectively, when I think of a Ghanaian citizen, I think of a nice, good person. And I know it's a generalization. However, having spoken to the 8 to 10, if not 12 Ghanaian guests, I think my belief was reinforced. So that's the one country that I'll definitely go to in the next year. The COVID-19 restrictions were problematic, but I'll definitely be making my way to Accra, because I think there's so much to learn about how you can combine humility with progress. Ghana, I think, has a good combination of that. It's one country that has managed to stay out of the broad negative politics of the continent, but they play such an important role in shaping not only Ghana, but in shaping this Africa that all of us want to see, a prosperous Africa. So that's the one country that I'll definitely be visiting, Accra, Ghana. I'm definitely making my way there soon.
Okay. I mean, let me put myself on the line so that there's witnesses from the people who are listening. I've actually never been to Ghana myself, and it's obviously been on my radar. COVID has really disrupted all of us in terms of travel. So as you make your plans, keep me in mind, and maybe when you hop to Ghana, I'll come with you, and then we can really see yeah, the interesting perspective, Ghana. So I'm really interested. So let's take that that conversation on.
Oh, awesome.
Cool. I want to close with this question. I think it's important that we fly the flag, just like we fly the flag of our countries when we're elsewhere. But even within the countries of our birth, I mean, South Africa being, our home countries, the both of us, you would understand how diverse the country is within itself. And so I think for the listeners, it's important then to understand, where were you born? Where did you grow up? Certainly, most of us have got this really authentic village upbringing. And then now, so many years later, we are hosts, and I'm referring to you when I say we, of very important platforms that seem to unlock the potential of the entire continent. So let's fly the flag of your hometown, your home village, and really understand, where you grew up, and just kind of take us through, high five your primary schools, high five your high schools, some interesting characters from your childhood. I think that brings us to a nice conclusion, if you can just do that for us.
Oh man, I'm smiling because I'm now going down memory lane. So I think I did say earlier, I'm South African, but within the country we have 9 provinces. So the northernmost province is Limpopo. That's where I'm from. But once you inside Limpopo province, you've got different towns. I happen to come from a village called Hamashau. And when I think of Hamashau, so yeah, I spent the first 17 years of my life there. I remember first, you couldn't really speak English to anyone, not even at school. So you will learn the English language through our vernacular. In my case, is Venda. If you can imagine how that even worked. So we had these shop owners, the small shop owners from India. So if you had an interest in learning or bettering your skills, your communication skills, the only thing you could do was to go to the shops and engage with these foreign shop owners in English. Said, gee, can I have a Coke and sweets? And that was it for the day. Like, oh, I have learned something today. So that's one memory that I have. I went to 3 different schools, starting with the primary school. Then for whatever reason, I chose to go to a senior primary school, which was probably a good 40 minutes away. So you'd walk to that school. As if that wasn't enough, when it was time to do my high school, I decided that I'll take, I'm estimating, but it was probably like a 20-kilometer walk every morning to get to that school. When you think about doing the 20 kilometers, obviously it takes a really long time to cover that distance. I'm referring to 10 kilometers one way, 10 kilometers back home. But what I remember from all those trips or all those travels to school is the conversations that you would have with your fellow students and the conversations that you will have with teachers, most of whom had never really been outside the village or whatever the small town, but they had this passion of wanting their pupils to do better. And, in a village, success is measured by you being able to exit, you being able to escape, in inverted commas, so that you can have a better life elsewhere. So I remember most of our teachers really emphasizing the point that you need to work hard if you are to have a chance to escape this life, which I suppose in their view wasn't so attractive. So that propelled us, personally, it propelled me to want to do better. And I suppose with some fortune, we were ultimately able to exit or to escape that environment to go to the big cities, which we sort of view as, now you have made it, you're successful, you no longer call the village your home. But I'll tell you, Lazola, home will always be home. This weekend, fun enough, I'm driving home. I'm excited because there's there's a level of connection that you get when you're home that says, I grew up here. This is my home. When I think of who I am at my core, Hamashau village shaped me into the person that I am. I continue to work on myself to be better, but my roots are deeply, deeply rooted within Hamashau. I speak Venda, so I'm from the Venda tribe within the South African context. So I'm really proud, and I continue to fly that flag. So yeah, thanks for asking the question. I have a lot to say. I didn't realize just how much I wanted to talk about Hamashau and my upbringing. But it's really good to be able to address that. And yeah, hopefully one or two kids in whether Hamashau or some other village will listen to this and maybe also want to pursue a similar path or go on their own and sort of chart their own path. You never know. But yeah, going back home remains one of my favorite things to do every time I get an opportunity to do so.
Beautifully summed up. It really brings us to a nice landing of this conversation. I think, I'll just ask you to share your last words, and the words really are for your closing of what you have built here. The last words that your listeners are going to hear from you, the 150 episode host. And I would just like to ask you to leave us with a few podcasts that you know of that are African, that we can actually listen to in the interim while the African Voices is on a break. I believe it's a break, but you said it's the end of the series. But we'll see what life shapes after that. But any last words from your side, your heart's content, and then leave us with a few African podcasts we can subscribe to.
No, thanks, Lazola. Obviously, the work that you guys are doing at Haditi Africa, I do follow that. I know we've spoken about that. And I do believe that we share the same vision in that sense, to really connect Africa through storytelling. The one that actually had a lot to do with me staying within the podcasting space, I mentioned it earlier, the Africa Tech Roundup, hosted by Andile Masuku, a Zimbabwean guy, spent a lot of time in South Africa. I believe now he's in the UK. I think he's also retired the podcast, but the content remains on the Africa Tech Roundup platform. So that's a really, really good podcast to listen to. The one that has maybe caught my eye or that I've been paying attention to lately is it's called Podcast and Chill with Magaiva Mukwebo, young South African guy. Maybe there's some vendor bias in me, but I like what him and his team, what they are building. I think they're building more than just a podcast, and the number of subscribers that they have, I think supports their vision. The next thing is not really a podcast, but it's a Twitter page that I think our listeners really need to pay attention to. It's called the Africa Facts Zone. You can just look up Africa Facts Zone on Twitter. It's an account managed by a Nigerian guy, and every day they post really interesting content about the continent, what's happening across, etc. So I really recommend that highly. There's one that our previous guest, Vusi Tembekwayo, launched late last year. You can just type Vusi Tembekwayo podcast. It's got these 10, 15-minute messages that he shares as a motivational speaker. I find a lot of value in that. So, Lazola, that's what comes to mind in terms of a good African content. I'm sure there's a lot more. Oh, I can't forget my friend Emmanuel Yegon. He runs a show. It's a YouTube channel. You can just type the I think it's called Mobile Journalism Africa. They're based in Kenya and they do really, really good work. They tell stories, they capture whatever videos on their phones. It's about mobile journalism, but it's a lot more than just that. So those are the ones that come up. In terms of the last words, I was thinking about this because I'm trying to put together a book about the podcast. And I was thinking about what I've learned, and this is what I will leave with our guests. Before starting the podcast, one of the motivations was my belief that every single person in this world has a story to tell, regardless of creed, regardless of where they are in terms of social class, regardless of gender or race. Every single person has a story to tell. They just need an opportunity to tell their story. I knew that before starting with the podcast. After 150 episodes, that I would say has been my biggest lesson. Sometimes I'll come home from work, I'm tired, I don't really feel like doing the show, so my energy level is low, and then 2 minutes into the conversation, you're hooked because you remember that every single person has a story to tell. So as we go about our business, as we meet thousands, hundreds of people on the streets every single day, take a moment to say hello, how are you, to a stranger. You may be surprised at how much you learn from just engaging with a stranger, regardless of gender, creed, etc. Talk to someone, say hello, find out who they are. You'll be blown away by the story that they have to share. Those will be my last words. So, thank you, Lazola, for being on the other side of the mic. It's really, really been a pleasure to be interviewed. It actually turned out to be really cool. 10 out of 10.
Thank you very much. Now, to our listeners, that was Avhurengwi Nengovhela, the ultimate host of 1,000 African Voices. His health, they have 150 episodes, 40 months, which equates to about 3 3/4 years. And he has really brought us beautiful content. This was a special edition episode as goodbye as a host of this podcast. And I think it was an honor for me to be given the opportunity to interview him. And I remember he interviewed me in episode 41, so I can understand how much work now goes into this. Just thinking about having to do this every week. We've certainly put the African flag up high. And I think just with the content that is there, there's a lot of work we could still do in publicizing it and spreading it far and wide to make sure that the African story is really highlighted and is really sustained. Thank you very much and good evening for today. Cheers.
1,000 African Voices.
You've been listening to 1,000 African Voices. Please join us next time as we bring you another African voice. 1,000 African Voices is produced by me, Avhurengwi, with Sam Garnich on sound production. For more information, including the contact details of our guests, visit us on our website, 1000africanvoices.com. You can also subscribe to our show on iTunes by searching for 1,000 African Voices. Please help us grow the project by logging on to 1000africanvoices.com to subscribe. Until next time, Kungana Africa, and take care.